Okay, so good morning. I'm Kelly Loss. I'm the librarian of the Ethics Center at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and thank you all for joining us for this workshop. Hopefully some more people will be joining us in just a couple minutes. But while we wait to get started, I just wanted to share just a few little things that'd be great if you could keep in mind as we move forward. Each session today is going to last about an hour and a half. So attendees, if you could please save your substantial questions until our discussion period at the end of the session. Panelists, if you we're going to be giving you a 8-minute and then a 1-minute warning via the chat when your time is running a little short. And but if you do end a little early, we will kind of open up the floor for some clarifying questions very quickly before we move on to the next presenter. If for some reason during the discussion section at the end of each session, we don't get to your questions, attendees, we will be saving the Q&A and we'll be sending your questions to the panelists to allow them to provide a written answer that we'll share with everyone just to make sure all the questions get answered. We're also going to be, you'll be able to use the link that you received to join this webinar on Saturday as well, and we'll be resending out a reminder tomorrow morning. And also we have an exit survey that we'd like everyone to fill out if you would, just to get a better idea of how we can run this a little better in the future, and then also to be able to connect if we have more ideas or things that we can build upon with all the interesting ideas that are going to be shared today. And then we'll also be following up with a collection of further readings, materials, and other resources from the presentations and discussion in a file email to all the panelists and attendees, just so we have sort of a collection of all the wonderful resources being shared today. So with that, I will turn things over to the director of the Ethics Center, Elizabeth Hills.
Good morning, happy lunchtime, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to our workshop, Building Inclusive Ethical Cultures in STEM. With this workshop, we seek to share best practices to effectively engage students and faculty in building inclusive ethical cultures. We'll talk about innovative approaches to embedding educational interventions in courses, research labs, and departments. This workshop is part of our NSF-funded project, a bottom-up approach to building a culture of responsible research and practice in STEM. The project has been run at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago and the University of Texas at San Antonio. The abstracts we received following our call, they were absolutely amazing. And I am very much looking forward to learning more about the fascinating projects the presenters are going to talk about today and tomorrow. And without further ado, let's just really right now begin with the first session. The first session will be chaired by Chris Miller, who is a professor in the Design Management Department at Savannah College of Art and Design in Savannah, Georgia. So it's your turn, Chris. Chris, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, again. Okay. Welcome again. I want to echo Elizabeth's welcome to everyone. And yes, we were so impressed with the abstracts that we received for this workshop, and we're looking forward to getting started. So our first presentation this morning will be by Dina Clemens. She is from the Research Ethics Education Program at the University of California at Riverside. And her project is Embedded Discourse, Lab-Based Conversations about Ethical Practice. Welcome, Dina.
Thanks very much. Let me go ahead and pull my presentation up here and we can get started. Terrific, thank you. So I'm delighted to be here this morning and to be on this particular panel in this session with my esteemed colleagues. And I'm looking forward to hearing about all of the other very promising approaches as we go through the next couple of days. So I'm here to briefly talk about the research project entitled Institutional Reengineering of Ethical Discourse in STEM, or IREDS, But before I get into some of the details of that project, let me quickly make some acknowledgements. So this was an institutional transformation grant funded by the Cultivating Cultures of Ethical STEM program of NSF. And we also had very generous support from the graduate division at my university, UC Riverside. And I'd like to take a moment to just thank and acknowledge the entire research team. At UCR, Erica Baranski, Kevin Esterling, Juliette McMullen, David Lowe, Kyle Harp, and Joe Childers. And for the Center for Open Science, Courtney Soderberg, Tim Arrington, and Brian Nosek. So at its most basic, the goal of the IREDS approach is to make engaged and meaningful discussions about ethical research practices within labs a day-to-day part of research, and to help make more clear the connection between ethical and good research practices, which in turn produces good research. Current approaches to education and research ethics, or RCR, are less than optimal. Most RCR training happens away from the lab or the research group, usually delivered online, sometimes in classrooms, sometimes some combination of both, and it's frequently just a simple transfer of knowledge. RCR education is arguably more relevant when lab members learn about the ethical dimensions of practice in the place where they practice, and in the context of their specific research projects, and together with the PI in a collaborative effort to come to a shared understanding about the values and norms which guide their work. The work of the lab happens of necessity communally, and there is an obligation in some very real ways for each lab member to be invested in that work. Our commitment to these ideas, informed by the theoretical orientation of deliberative communication, as well as the idea of communities of practice, led to the research project which informs this approach. So this idea of deliberative communication has, as an ideal form, reasoned, uncoerced, and transparent argumentation for and against decisions that are arrived at collectively. And as Thomas England, a researcher in education and democracy, wrote, deliberative communication can be understood as an endeavor to ensure that each individual takes a stand by listening, deliberating, seeking arguments, and evaluating, while at the same time there is a collective effort to find values and norms on which everyone can agree. So I want to take a moment to focus on two specific aspects found in these definitions. So first, the idea of transparent argumentation and reason giving. It's an important one per se, and it's often overlooked in conversations about transparency, which tend to focus on transparency of scientific methods, data analyses, research results. So this transparency of reason, evaluation, and argumentation is essential for a group, a lab, a research group, any collaborative endeavor, to be on the same page, or at the very least to know where the pages are off and why and how. And this collective effort to find values and norms on which everyone can agree is the second aspect I wanted to focus on. Understood and shared norms and values are essential to good science broadly, and to the manifestation of specific practices that are part of the production of scientific knowledge, for instance, data management and authorship attribution. So in this way, this deliberative approach is both a normative and epistemic good. It's justified discussion about what should be chosen and what should be avoided. Or as scholar Peter Pereira wrote, it seeks the most defensible course of action in the specific circumstances under consideration. So we wanted to assess what impact this kind of collective deliberative conversation might have in the lab environment, and how that might be manifested in specific practices, and compare that with typical approaches to RCR training. So IREDS was a randomized trial of a project-based, peer-facilitated research ethics curriculum delivered in 34 university science and engineering labs representing 184 individual participants, which included PIs. The intervention was a curriculum focusing on authorship attribution and data management, and the curriculum was integrated into and delivered with a demonstration of the open science framework. And so let me note here, in the interest of time and in this context of the broad overview of the research which validated this approach. I'm not presenting all of the research here, nor will I be talking about data analyses, but you can find all of that information in the paper and the supplementary materials which were made available to you. And also absolutely everything from this project is on an OSF site, which is publicly available. So just briefly, a survey was our primary data source, and it contained 2 types of questions. The first type was just a direct measure of exposure to the important elements of the training intervention. So does your lab have an authorship policy? Does your lab have data management policy? And has the importance of ethics discussions become more relevant to you? And then the second type of question on the survey was designed to create scales that measure latent concepts of interest. So conceptually, one can think of these survey items as indicators that help to measure an underlying or latent variable that is of conceptual interest, but that cannot readily or easily be measured directly. So the scales that we had for this survey were quality of lab communication and understanding training content, but I wanted to focus on lab communication first. So one of the scales measured respondents' beliefs about the relevance of ethics discourse for their research. And those questions were, how relevant to your area of work is learning about ethical research practices? To what extent do you agree that seeking out others in your lab to discuss ethical research practices is your responsibility as a scientist? Do you have discussions with members of other labs regarding ethical research practices? Another assessed perceptions of respectful discussion. If there was disagreement, would lab members in your lab make reasonable points and try to make valid arguments? When discussing research, does everyone have a real opportunity to speak with no one inappropriately dominating the discussions? When discussing research with your lab, do lab members listen to one another respectfully and courteously? Do lab members seem to hear and understand your views? How confident are you that your lab coworkers will use ethical research practices when conducting research? And these were the questions that sort of assess that deliberative approach to communication. Mm-hmm. And finally, there was a set of questions asking about lab disagreement. How often are there disagreements in your lab about research practices? How often are there disagreements in your lab about authorship? And how often are there disagreements in your lab about data management, since those were the items of interest for here. So those individuals who participated in the training were statistically more likely to believe that ethics discourse is relevant to their scientific work, that discourse within their labs was respectful and open to diverse views, and that the climate for discussion in the labs was more constructive in the sense that disagreements over lab practice were reduced. These 3 scales indicate that labs who went through the training better approximated deliberative communication ideals, in that discussion surrounding research and ethical practices was more respectful, open, diverse, and constructive. So we have had the chance, after this research was concluded, to actually turn this into an IRIDS approach as opposed to the IRIDS research. And we have actually done this approach, delivered this approach in labs. And in one lab that we were working with, this was an HHMI investigator-led lab, and we did a session on data management. And here's what the PI said to me in an email afterwards. At the end of our lab meeting, we briefly talked about how to make use of what we learned in the hour spent with you. I just wanted to mention that in response, we will take up data management again in a group meeting in January, and that small groups are going to discuss and make suggestions on the following topics: more universal notebook guidelines, converting data from proprietary software to open standard software, answering that question if certain files were actually uploaded as agreed on in March, file organization, data deposition. Some of these are recurring topics, others are new and have not previously been discussed. And that was something that came out in the conversation that we had with them. And then he said, I think this hour was a better stimulus for better data management in my lab than a top-down approach. So in order for deliberation to be successful, all of the lab members, including the PI, must work to create a culture and climate of respect so that everyone has a chance to share their perspective, everyone is actually heard, and everyone knows that their opinions matter. Results of the research showed that lab members perceived improvements in the quality of discourse on research ethics within their labs and had an enhanced awareness of the relevance of that discourse to their work. This approach represents a paradigm shift compared to more typical module-based or classroom ethics instruction, which is divorced from the everyday workflow and practices within labs, and it's designed to cultivate a campus culture of ethical STEM research in the very work settings where lab members interact. So we hope the IREDS approach can serve as a model of project-based research ethics training that can make science research more inclusive, more transparent, and more credible. And we hope that, one will work toward discovering the best practices for their lab in this collaborative, cooperative, interactive way. One of the things that this does is help flatten the hierarchy, as Joseph Schwab, who writes about learning communities, says, authority while present is muted, and that's sort of an important piece of how this works. And inclusion and diversity are strengths of and integral to the process. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dina. Good timing. I think we have time for one or two clarifying questions only. We ask that you save your questions for the end of the session, but we will take one or two clarifying questions if you have any.
And feel free to type those in the Q&A if you are an attendee, or in the chat if you're a panelist, and we'll share those.
Okay. All right, I think we are good. Thank you so much, Dina. Very interesting, and look forward to hearing more about that project. Our second panelists are going to be talking about neuroethical ethos, a case study in reframing neuroethics education for engineers and researchers. In the panel today, we have Juhi Faruqi, Sarah Daywood, Dev Sarma, and Joseph Maria Balaguer. And if they are ready, the panel can take the screen. Welcome.
Thank you all for having us here. So I think I'll wait for Juhi to start the slides. Yeah, so thanks a lot for having us. As Chris mentioned, we're talking today about our efforts to create kind of a neuroethical ethos is the word that we're using, which we'll explain in a little bit. And mostly this is a way that we as trainees, so all of us are grad students, and I'm a postdoc in our group, and we're trying to figure out different ways to put neuroethics training into our normal training courses in a way that isn't really separated or removed from the normal sort of course of work. So the rehab neural engineering labs, Juhi, next slide, is a consortium of multiple cross-disciplinary research groups. We have about 12 PIs that bridge across bioengineering, physical medicine, rehabilitation, and a couple other departments, including neurosurgery. And we have grad students, we have clinicians, we have coordinators. It's about 60, actually it's about now 80 researchers from different backgrounds who are all working within this neural engineering space. And so this is sort of restorative prosthetics, rehab engineering, building devices and implantable systems for restoring lost function. And so as you might expect, engaging with ethics is very critical, right? We're working with human subjects, we're working with research that affects people's lives. Thinking about this is very, very critical and unavoidable for the work that we do. But typically, this comes out as something that's very regulatory or very didactic. The interactions that most of us as engineers and scientists have is either through the IRB or ACOOKs for animal work, mandatory trainings that we might have, or required coursework. And it all seems actually very removed from the actual work, and it's very much an imposition or sort of a checkbox. And so we try to think about how we can maybe do this in a slightly better way for us. Sarah, you're muted.
Sorry. So in thinking about how we can do this better, we first kind of took an inventory of the existing frameworks that we already have. And like Dev mentioned, they tend to be didactic. They tend to also generally focus on analytical reasoning skills and familiarity with professional codes of ethics. And though those are key pieces of ethics education, they've been proven to be modestly effective, as we see in the Antas et al. Studies. We don't see people actually adapting their behaviors to these forms of ethics education. So we kind of came to this question of, can driving people to act ethically and professionally, given the norms of their field, actually be done by the development of analytical reasoning skills and familiarity with professional codes of conduct alone. So yes, so from that we came to the core question: how do we make ethics a natural part of our research environment instead of an external imposition? And in doing so, we kind of came up with this concept. Move to the next slide. Yes, so the concept that we came up with is the neuroethical ethos. And we hope that through a neuroethical ethos, a research culture will be developed where ethics is an organic part of every stage of the research process. And how we want to do that is through an understanding that people's genuine actions reflect their values. And so part of ethical education should include the values and motivations of individuals. And so creating a space where people can actually basically look at their own values and their own motivations as they relate to their work and engage them critically in a group setting where they're free to explore not only their own values and motivations, but other people's values and motivations, without feeling like there's some sort of punitive or value laden consequence to it is what we wanted to do and create in our sessions. So this is a horizontal and inclusive approach, and we hope that it would create a horizontal inclusive neuroethic instead of a hierarchical one.
Okay, so in thinking about trying to develop this framework and develop this idea of a neuroethical ethos, we consider this to be essentially a cycle, and we've split this up into 4 broad sections. So we start with the idea of topic identification, and this is the process of recognizing and identifying ethical issues or ethical questions that are relevant and applicable to one's own research and one's own interests. And this part, we, as discussion leaders, kind of we start out, doing this process in the beginning, and the hope is to bring people around to the point where they're able to start really doing this process organically themselves. Once we've identified a set of topics, we have dialogues and discussions, and the structure of these is meant to allow people to engage with the question or engage with the issue in a meeting of peers in this very horizontal space where they are not kind of being didactically taught to, but rather talking with a set of experts. This dialogue is meant to promote a sense of ownership, in a sense, internalizing and recognizing how one's own experiences, one's own expertise relate to the topic, and how the topic itself is relevant to one's own understandings and values. And finally, our goal is to really have this internalization or this ownership of values manifest as application of the principles that we've discussed into people's actual research day-to-day practices. So when we talk about topic identification, we really try to focus in on a few different angles. We look at what are the questions that the field is asking. And that can be, what are the questions that are being raised in literature? What are the questions being raised by the national organizations, by large meetings? Basically, what is at the forefront of the minds of people working in the field. We are also interested in looking at what are the questions that researchers themselves are asking, and this can be formally asking as part of their research. Or also informally. We're trying to lean into the fact that researchers are also whole people, and also think about ethical questions, think about neuroethics and the ethics of their work outside of their professional lives. And so trying to pull in the things that are really interesting and engaging to people who are working in the field. And then also being topical and current. What are the issues that are relevant right now? So based on the topics that we identify, we move into dialogue and synthesis. The way we structure this is we try to engage some academic expertise. So that can be academic literature, that can be topic area experts from people who actually study the topic from an academic lens. We also try to engage practical experts. What we mean by that is we are looking at people who are working within our lab who regularly encounter the practical application of the topic or issue that we're talking about. So for instance, if we're talking about the ethics of consent, we'll bring in someone in our lab who regularly works with consenting research participants. And we bring these together along with a set of guiding questions that we come up with to help really frame the dialogue. We encourage this dialogue to take place on a very level playing field. So again, it's not the expert is coming to tell you things, it's we are having a conversation and this expert is here to provide context. And we really emphasize also the importance of lived expertise. Your own lived experiences, your own values really come to bear on the discussions that we're having. And throughout all of these, we really try to make a point to prompt participants to actively consider how the topic intersects with their own research. We think that's a really active process that people should engage in. So by doing this, by creating this open penalty-free discussion forum, we're empowering researchers to reason about neuroethics on their own terms, to think about it in terms of their own values, their own experiences, their own both personal experiences and research experiences, in order to promote a sense of ownership, in order to feel that these principles are not simply abstract ethical principles that are being taught to me, but really are aligned with and integrated with my own personal values. We also believe that regularly engaging with these issues in community can lead to the emergence of shared insights, right? So this idea of shared values, shared goals, as well as individual values and individual goals. And in doing that, in kind of jointly exploring and articulating these goals and values, we can then have these internal insights that allow a neuroethical ethos or a culture of ethics to emerge.
And so what we hope at the end of that process is that this is now being applied by the researchers, right? So that they've internalized this ownership of these principles and they can now put that into the work itself, right? From the very aspect of asking scientific questions to recruiting subjects to, funding for grants, like having these things built into the way that we're asking and thinking about these problems. And then the other side of that is to actually empower researchers to complete the cycle by identifying topics that they think are relevant to their research. And one way this has come up in the last year, next slide, Judy, is so in how we've sort of adapt to the needs of the moment. So we started this whole process about almost 2 years ago now. And then with the pandemic, obviously things got shut down and we moved to this virtual space. But in doing that, right, in the wake of sort of the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing protests that came around, there was an awareness in our lab that we need to be doing more to be actively anti-racist. And so we started to think about how we could connect that social awareness that our lab was developing to these ideas of neuroethics. And so we expanded our topics to include things around disparity, trust, and access to medical research, and brought in experts in those fields to specifically think about how we can engage with that as neural engineers and how our work fits into that space, right? And it's been a very, very positive movement. And one of the things we're trying to do then is assess, okay, how has this process of creating a culture changed, or how are we doing with this? And so one of the things we've been doing is recording discussions to evaluate engagement. And so what we're really looking at here is to think about the spontaneous movement of conversations. So we provide some guiding discussion questions, but we really want researchers and trainees to kind of move that conversation in whatever space they think is most relevant for their work, right? And by sort of tracking that, we're able to see how well people have internalized the concepts that we're talking about, and also how much they're considering it and to what level they're considering it. And then we're trying to actually ask people afterwards using virtual feedback forms which in the age of Zoom and other online forums, the amount of submissions we had initially was pretty low, but over time this started to increase, which has been really positive. And to give you kind of an example of some of those, the feedback that we get from our group is, things like, we really enjoy the structure of the seminar. They enjoy having the guest speaker with the breakout sessions, but the most important sort of feedback from this particular person is that they're comfortable. They don't have to address every question. They can just sort of talk about these things, right? It's not, they have to get some actual score, actual thing. They can just enjoy the conversation itself. They acknowledge that some of the discussions are really difficult to tackle because of the nature of these topics. And this particular one was about trust in medical research. But having that expert there to actually be able to have this conversation, enable them to really think about how we could do that in our own research, right? And then on the application side, people are actually thinking about some of the topics that we're taking about and thinking about creating transfer tools or other aspects in the actual work that could affect the communities that we're dealing with, right? And so we still have a lot to do, and it's still an ongoing process, but it's been quite rewarding so far.
Okay, so to wrap up, a few thoughts based on our experiences at RNEL. One is that we really encourage engaging researchers as their whole selves, really acknowledging the fact that people are thinking about ethics and do think about things beyond their research as they relate to their research, and really trying to bring those aspects of themselves into the lab, into the professional environment, and into these discussions. We also believe very strongly in encouraging an active reflection on the way that scientific ethics, which again can sometimes feel like a bit of an abstract concept. So really encouraging people to actively think about how that intersects with their lives, with their lived values and their lived experiences. We also want to emphasize this idea of engineering discourse. What we mean by that is thinking very critically about how your audience is likely to engage with the topics that you're bringing to them or the topics that you're trying to engage them on. And based on that, building and providing frameworks to help actively shape those conversations and that engagement towards the shared goals. And finally, we've seen throughout this that it has been really important to be flexible and be responsive. And that means, partly identifying the needs and interests of the people who participate in these discussions, but also being adaptable and acknowledging that those needs and interests do shift over time and with additional context, and being adaptive and responsive to that. So with that, thank you all so much for being here. Also want to acknowledge the Center for Bioethics and Health Law at the University of Pittsburgh and Rehab Neural Engineering Labs, which have been super supportive of this work. And yeah, we can take any clarifications.
Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation and project. And again, look forward to hearing people's questions and hearing more about it. We do have time for a couple clarifying questions. Does anyone want to add something to the chat? Okay. All right, it looks like we're good to move on. All right, so our next presentation for this panel is my home group. Our presentation will be on a bottom-up approach to building a culture of responsible research and practice in STEM. Presenting this morning, Elizabeth Hilt, who is the director of the CSEP. We have Kelly Loss, myself. I am with the Savannah College of Art and Design in Savannah, Georgia. We have Eric Bray, Laura Gaviria, and Francesca Acosta. So thank you all again for being here, and I'll turn this over to Elizabeth.
Great, thank you, Chris. Yes, I'm going to present about our project, a bottom-up approach to building a culture of responsible research and practice in STEM. And you've already introduced our project team, Kelly Lass, Chris Miller, Eric Bray, Stephanie Taylor, our research assistant, and our wonderful team from the University of Texas at San Antonio. With our project, we are trying to do two things. First, identify factors that are relevant to ethical STEM, and on the other hand, promote the cultivation of an ethical culture in research labs. And we developed a project in which we asked graduate students to build guidelines that are based on ethics codes, and to build those guidelines so that they relate to their specific labs, to their specific contexts. Our idea was to move ethics education directly in the lab, to have graduate students actively involved. And our idea was to have them put together guidelines that are useful for their own everyday life lab situation. So our assumption was that these guidelines, that they complement existing codes and guidelines, and that they are really specific to the author's environment. And I listened carefully to what you did in the presentation before. When you talked about ownership, we were also thinking that it would help that the students, they develop these guidelines that are specific to their environment on their own, and they may feel a sense of ownership, and they may understand the ethical situation in their research lab, ethical research and ethical research practice issues much better when they think the whole thing through, what could matter in their own situation, and not just learn anything theoretical about ethics or ethics codes or something. Another assumption we had, that ethics education doesn't occur only in the classroom, but that that it occurs basically everywhere in the research lab, in the whole, and that the organizational context plays a role, that the peer environment plays a role, that the behavior of other students, the values, the beliefs of people around them, what they consider important, that all of this matters, and that all of this comes in when it's about the question of ethical culture and research ethics. And what we did in our project, we had 4 departments at the Illinois Institute of Technology involved: the biology department, biomedical engineering department, physics department, and physics and biological engineering. And in each of these departments, we asked a student facilitator to help us put together a graduate student committee on ethics in STEM. And this group met 6 to 7 times, and they were the group that put together, in this bottom-up approach, kind of from the students to the rest of the university. This was our idea, guidelines based on ethics codes about all those aspects that they consider relevant to their own laboratory environment. We had around 6 to 7 sessions of those students' ethics committees. In the beginning, the project team provided some input on ethics codes and guidelines. And we also let the students analyze their discipline-specific ethics codes. And then they discussed a case study and started talking about their own lab situation, and discuss their own lab situation, ethical issues they have encountered in their own lab situation. And I want to stress that an important aspect of this was that it was done in a confidential way, so there was no other team member present beyond the graduate students, so that they felt safe to discuss these ethical issues that they have seen in their labs or that they have heard about. And based on this, they started drafting guidelines about what they thought could be helpful in the future for dealing with ethical issues, and then further discuss and refine those guidelines. The goal of the guidelines was to complement existing policies. We didn't think that we wanted to reinvent the wheel again. And they are for sure not a complete list of ethical issues that may ever happen in labs, but just what the students considered important. And there were a number of recurring topics, but those guidelines were clearly specific to the departments. Sciences, engineering differed, whether it's wet labs or computer-focused work, and also the department situation clearly mattered when there were recent events in the department. So this played a role. The way this guideline writing review process was done, the Student Ethics Committee, they developed their first initial draft, and then we asked a friendly faculty member to review it and to provide comments, and then we sent it back to the Student Ethics Committee to look at the faculty comments, to think about it, to think about the comments, to revise the comments. And then the project team presented those guidelines at a faculty department meeting and asked for comments, and we integrated those. And then we circled them back again to the students. And overall, the idea was to get the department, the research groups involved in the discussion with a goal either to adopt a version of the guidelines in their departments, in their research groups, or to become aware of what the students say and maybe make some change based on the feedback and the discussion. So there were basically two different levels of potential goals, potential outputs. So the guidelines in the 4 departments, 4 different guidelines put together by the students. There were main themes across all 4 guidelines. The role of the professional investigation, the role of the PI played a huge role. The need to have clearly defined expectations and responsibilities. Work hours, vacation policies played a role. Good research practices, publication practices, and authorships. These were the main themes. And to divide this a bit more up, topics like fairness, discrimination, abusive behavior played a large role, the expectations by PIs, responsibilities, shared resources, how to deal with sharing resources, safety issues, safety training, meeting with PIs, and accountability. These were the main topics. We coded those guidelines, and the numbers show the frequency, how often they showed up. Then the students put those documents together. We didn't influence what they wrote, but the students also had some thoughts on the life cycle of those documents. For example, the BME students, they wrote in the preface of their guidelines that the guidelines are intended to be a living document and should be reviewed and revised on a regular basis. And what is interesting, among 3 of the 4 groups came up with the idea that some sort of ethics committee would be helpful in this context. And for example, the students from the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering, they wanted an ethics officer to be appointed and to have this person address ethical incidents and perhaps refer to a committee as a whole. And the physics students, they saw an ethics committee as a resource, as an educational body. So to summarize our Illinois Tech experience before we hand over to the UTSA group, overall, our project clearly raised awareness of ethical and social issues in research labs. And it was interesting to see that the topics discussed were much broader than the classical RCR topic, classical research, responsible conduct of research topics. They were a lot about social issues, communication issues. We clearly realized there is a need to address concern of international students and students from minority groups, as they are not heard that often, and concerns came up in this context. And overall, the project gives students a voice and empowers the students. The mere fact that graduate students, they put together a text that was read by faculty, and faculty become aware of what their problems are within the department or within certain labs. So in general, what students have, the position of students has mattered a lot. And as I said, 3 or 4 committees proposed an ethics council or an ethics committee with student and faculty members representing everyone. So now I'm handing over to the UTSA experience to Laura, Francesca, and Eric.
Yeah, so I'll talk, I guess I'll go ahead and get started. So in terms of just putting what Dr. Hope just said, an application. So at UTSA, we were able to basically duplicate the experience at what was done at IIT with the guidance and the resources developed at IIT. So once Dr. Bray moved over to UTSA and became the BME chair, we kind of wanted to implement the practices that they had developed within our own department. So Dr. Bray, being the chair at the BME department, kind of took kind of a backseat role. So we actually worked in practice with the faculty liaison, or I guess I would call it, which was Dr. Gaviria. And then me, Francisca, I actually served as a kind of like the graduate student leader to actually helped facilitate the discussions within the graduate students, and actually served as kind of like the in-between between the faculty and the students in terms of actually establishing the guidelines that we ended up with. So how we actually did this, and as they discussed previously, we kind of met as a team of graduate students without any faculty members present. And then we kind of had 6 workshop sessions between us. And I put here in the slides kind of what each session comprised of. So the 2 main key points that I'll say is the workshop 1 and workshop 2 were pretty critical. So at the end of workshop 1, which we actually, after we introduced the whole concept and kind of discussed why we were doing what we were doing, we sent out a survey, which kind of served as the framework of actually the following workshops. So this survey kind of just asked the students, so this was an anonymous survey, so through Google Forms, where we asked the students to provide us feedback of, okay, what topics of our interest to you that you would like to be implemented or represented within the guidelines for our specific department, for our specific school. So this survey, the students just wrote their little hearts out of what they thought was important to them. And then on workshop number 2, we actually started a discussion of the topics that they presented to us. And I put a workshop number 2 was also very important because it actually was kind of a shifting point within our specific experience, since we found that the students were very hesitant to actually be forthcoming in terms of their discussion. So even though they were, very elaborate in their surveys initially, we also thought once we met in person and actually wanted to have these conversations, they were kind of a little shy to come out and actually start having these conversations. So another thing that we implemented after our second workshop is that we started bringing in flashcards derived from the survey, which served as kind of like starting speaking points between the students. So this allowed us for the discussions to start a little bit more freely. So without like an individual person having to bring up a specific topic, the topics were already predetermined prior to our discussions. So the discussions were a lot more productive that way. And then for the last 3 workshops, we actually just worked on the writing. After the writing was kind of finalized within the students, like mentioned previously, we presented to a faculty ally, refined the guidelines, and then this was presented to faculty. So next slide. So we don't have time to actually show you the actual guidelines, but I'll go very quickly over what the guidelines actually comprised of. So they had 3 main sections, which is general rules, faculty guidelines, and student guidelines. So the general rules, like we said, we weren't going to try to reinvent the wheel. So we put pre-established guidelines into the document, or kind of references to those. And then for the faculty and students, highlighted in the slide are basically bullet points that we thought was important for our specific department. The last thing you'll notice is that for our specific guidelines, the majority or the bulk of the actually document were kind of appendices. So we purposely wanted to keep the guidelines relatively short, but we wanted to provide resources which would kind of serve as supporting and why the guidelines were what they were. And within that specifically, we also included very detailed notes of the conversations that were had between the grad students in order to provide context and references for future discussions. So if somebody goes back and does the guidelines again, they'll know why we said it's important to have transparency in your research practices, as an example. So next slide. So I guess for this slide, I just want to say for our specific UTSA experience, so the lessons learned that we thought we would wanted to point out is that it's very important that you have very important leadership and supporting leadership involved in this. So between Dr. Bray, Dr. Gaviria, and myself, we all were very invested in the success of this happening. So for this, so I think that was one of the major reasonings that we actually had such a successful experience coming from UTSA. With the diversity of the participants, obviously everybody's going to have a different viewpoint, and actually listening to your participants, or the grad students in this case, was very, very important. And like I mentioned, establishing a nominee, or making sure that students trust you in terms of, and keeping everything anonymous, so nothing goes back towards the research labs, was very important. And one thing I will point out is, which is the very last sentence on this slide, is that, which was very heartwarming to me as a grad student, and at the time, is that all these, we as grad students, I think, even though we know that changes happen very slowly, but we hope that these changes are actually will help probably not ourselves, because over time things will take time, but students were very, very very, very stern about that. They wanted that the changes to help these future generations. So that's something that I think keeps in mind, and something that's very nice to see whenever you do these such experiences. So next slide. And like I said, very mirroring kind of the IIT conclusions. These kind of conclusions came from UTSA, that communication and managing expectations of utmost importance, and the empowerment, obviously, it's a key point as well. And that iteration, so constant feedback from students and faculty, is also a very good thing. But I will say, to kind of conclude and see where is this now in terms of practice, the faculty discussions were had at UTSA. They were very positive, very open, and we obviously can talk more about that during the discussion time. And also the department now is implementing changes where they're actually using these guidelines as a framework to adjust policies and hopefully change things for the better as we move forward. So.
I just want to raise your awareness of the draft workshop module. We are in the process of putting together. That includes a teaching guide, slide deck, model handouts, and model feedback and assessment surveys. You can find the draft version of all of this at the link provided on the last slide. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful. We have a few minutes, I believe, for clarifying questions in the chat, if anyone has one. Good. It's great to see the chat is active. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again. And if we can move on to our final panel in this session, we have Karina Vilma from the Department of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And she will be presenting a very timely topic on building connections using culturally relevant practices in STEM departments. So welcome, Karina.
Thank you. And in listening to a lot of these presentations, this is great to be considering some of the ethical issues that you are considering. And I do want to point out that my presentation is coming from a perspective of an education specialist. I am an engineering education professor, and this is what will be presented in this session is, or in this presentation, is more of the theoretical background for culturally relevant practices, as well as some examples. And because of the diversity of STEM fields, then you'll see several examples. But in doing so, I want to start off by practicing what I preach. And so I want to tell you a little bit about my story. I'm a first-generation college student. Math with computer science was my undergrad degree. And I love math and science, everything related to it, building things, destroying things. My family didn't have much growing up, but I learned to be resourceful because of it. I became a teacher in my previous life. I loved teaching, especially connecting, helping students make connections between their lives and the STEM work that they were doing at school. And so now as an assistant professor, I try to do the same for my students. And so this is very important and close to me because of my background, as well as the type of future that I envision for the STEM fields. And trying to go to the next slide. So some of the things to consider when we talk about inclusivity in STEM is how we have this underrepresentation of learners that are diverse in STEM fields. A lot of folks frame this problem as a problem of being able to solve some of the most challenging problems that are ahead of us. In fact, some of the problems that we are seeing now cannot be solved simply with one discipline. We need multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary education. We also are looking at the global boundaries are being erased. We are, we know about different cultures and different parts of the world. And so the problem is usually phrased in that way, and that we need to be inclusive. However, I also want to point out that students and individuals that do not feel included in the STEM fields feel like they have to assimilate, like they have to become part of that culture or do things as they're expected to do. It becomes very tiring. Some people get battle fatigued, which is sort of this notion of having to explain yourself or, prove your worth. There's deficit thoughts about certain groups within the fields, as well as imposter syndrome. When you are a part of the field, you may not feel like you belong there. And a number of other syndromes that I would say. And so in order to break some of these, I want to talk about culturally responsive education and how we can help individuals feel valued within STEM, as well as in the workplace, in the cultures, and bridging some of those backgrounds that we bring to the table. Understanding that we are not a blank slate, that we have experiences that we come with. And also, this is always helpful to talk about the greater purpose, which is helping society and doing things, solving problems that matter. So what is culturally responsive education? There's three main points, and some of you in your presentation may not know that you might be doing this, but this is part of some of the theory in education. And we want to bring it into the STEM fields. So in culturally relevant education, we use learners' social capital in the academic setting, in this case, in STEM settings. So we have to think creatively about how to bring the social, cultural, the personal, academic, and experiential knowledge into the academic field, so that understanding that all of the problems that we're trying to solve have this social component related to it. The other is to believe that all learners can succeed in STEM. And this is important because there's some deficit notions that unknowingly sometimes creep into some of these practices of when we're teaching or when we're learning, that make us feel like perhaps we don't belong. So we need to, this is one of the tenets for culturally relevant education. And finally is to develop that social political consciousness, which exposes and attempts to deconstruct some of the oppressive systems. And a lot of that is done by doing some critical examining discourse, the discourses of power. We can do that through dialogue. We can do that with those that are in power. and creating these safe spaces where we can do that. So the question that I have is, how do we acknowledge and highlight and honor a learner's background to empower them in the STEM fields? So there's different ways to do this. One way is to use what is called the funds of knowledge. And this is when students' cultural practices in STEM related knowledge are used in the STEM instruction. So how students learn about math or about science or engineering. Sometimes we don't bring that into the instruction. And so doing that would be using funds of knowledge. Cultural modeling is another way, which is a framework that is used to design learning environments that take into account familiar data where the students are actually the experts. So this could be related to a specific topic that is relevant to students, something that they want to address, that they feel like they know a lot of information about this particular topic. So they would become experts in this area. And this could be done, as you can imagine, in different ages for different groups. However, these have been more prevalent in the K-12 setting, but are now starting to be practiced more in the undergrad and grad level by some pioneers in engineering education specifically. 3 other practices that help to build these connections is one of them is called community cultural wealth. So understanding that all of the knowledge that specific groups, and for this theory, we want to draw on socially marginalized groups, such as underrepresented minorities, women. We want to acknowledge that their skills and knowledge, their abilities, they all contribute in some way or can contribute in the STEM fields. And many times we've seen designs, for example, of technologies that don't take into account women or that don't test medications on women. And then we see these side effects after they're implemented. And so this is one of the main reasons for taking some of this community cultural wealth into account. Another is the third space. So this one is a little complicated, but it's using the traditional educational spaces to critically evaluate, challenge, and deconstruct practices of what is valued in these spaces. So it would be, thinking critically about how we do science, for example, or how things operate within how they're solved, or even the scientific method, thinking critically about all of these practices and almost creating a third space, right? So it is creating a third space where your ideas, where students or learners' ideas are incorporated. And last but not least, in these examples that I provide here, is this traditional ecological knowledge. And this is used to bring in knowledge, especially for Native American students, that acknowledges their background, which is handed down through generations, and perhaps in stories that are told as an important way of learning, and incorporates it into students' learning as well. So I want to provide a simplified model of what this practice might look like in action when we're trying to build culturally responsive practices. So first, we want to start with the desired outcomes and objectives. And throughout this, I do want to say that this last point, to surround yourself, whether you're an educator or you're a student, you want to surround yourself with support that helps to create these type of spaces in educational settings. So we want to start with these objectives and outcomes. We cannot a lot of times I'm asked, how can the curriculum continue to be rigorous, right? A lot of people fear the rigor will be lost because of this, but I want to challenge that this is actually more rigorous because it becomes connected to social issues, to communities. And so we want to look at what are those desired outcomes, whether it's in the classroom, if it's related to STEM content, whether it's within a department, if it's building community. And we want to include these culturally relevant educational objectives in helping to connect those that are part of those communities, connect their backgrounds to what is being done in the decision-making, as well as in the learning of different content. And with that, then we can design activities that integrate these objectives. And as educational leaders, we would lead those activities. But as you learned from the previous discussion, it's important to create this safe space so that individuals are able to critically reflect upon their own experiences and learning. And so this does not happen. It's not a one-time thing. It has to be part of a culture. And then we have to go back and assess those objectives that we started off with. How are we doing? And that wheel starts again, because we will have to adjust our objectives and outcomes and perhaps adjust the activities, create new activities or new spaces for people to feel safe to have these discussions. So again, I want to stress that leaders are those that help to build these bridges and bridge the connections. And there's a number of leaders that we can obviously point to. I consider myself a leader leading a course. However, I also believe that the chairs and deans have a place in this. And all of us can encourage personal connections through modeling, leading by example. Again, I started the presentation by saying a little bit about myself. That opens up the door. When you're in a position of power, it opens the door for others who see you in a position of power to be more open to doing the same. And to learn from each other, lead by example. These practices end up becoming a norm for the culture. It's not easy, but it has to be done consistently. There needs to be opportunities for critical reflection. Some examples are to allow time during department meetings for faculty to discuss their backgrounds and ask very tough questions about the processes that take place and some of the culture issues that might be happening. Share faculty members' research, for example, is another way, and how they became interested in them, how they connected their backgrounds to their research, providing safe spaces for innovation. Again, sometimes we feel like something fails when we try to incorporate these culturally responsive activities, but we have to create those safe spaces where we can learn from those experiences and gather more information to help us improve, and which leads us to the last one, is to gather data and talk to people that are stakeholders, report on the challenges. What are our challenges? Sometimes just reporting on them will help to spur some ideas on solutions, and celebrating the successes are important. So again, I want to quote Gloria Ladson-Billings, who talks about how helping students, and I would say helping all learners, to recognize and honor their own cultural beliefs and practices while acquiring access to the wider culture, and I put STEM in there. That is what helps us to help bridge, to build the bridge between the students and academics, to build persistence, empower students, right? Make it relevant to their lives, continuing with that rigorous training, and dismantling some of these deficit beliefs that are part of many of our cultures that that unfortunately have been within the STEM fields. For example, they've been called cold environments, right? Cold climate. The climate is cold within STEM. We want to dismantle some of these deficit beliefs. And so to provide some examples of culturally relevant projects for learners in STEM fields, these are general, but they can be tailored toward your specific content and courses. Students can collaborate with their family or the community that they live or work in to solve an engineering or scientific problem. Students can also share the analysis of various social injustices using STEM content, methods, principles such as analyzing data, right? Thinking critically about what's happening in communities and trying to get variables that are addressing those injustices. Students can also ask their own questions that are related to a STEM field or content and design their own ways of addressing these questions. So because they understand the community and they can ask their own questions, they can address them, and then they can do this while they're learning the scientific concepts, as well as the engineering design process. And
I believe we are
yes,
out of time.
thank you. That was actually my last slide. So I'll just leave it up here for a second, but I want to thank you for all the presentations as well, because I'm learning how you are implementing this within your own courses and fields. So thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay. I think we're doing pretty well on time. We want to leave time for some questions, but I've been doing my chair duties and taking lots of notes. And I want to just start the discussion Q&A by mentioning several, like 7 different themes that I saw come up mostly across all the presentations. So I would say that they are all extremely timely. And the focus on inclusivity is very much a part of that. And also, I think they all indicate that there is a paradigm shift underway, I really respond to the multiple disciplinarity, collaboration of the projects. That's really encouraging. There's also a very strong local bottom-up approach that's evident in all of them. We also have the all-in kind of every voice is important as a theme, transparency, accountability, and I really love to see that the addressing that the whole person and the values and lived experience of everyone is important in these processes. And finally, the integration of science, research, of practice and ethics, and how can that be done in a natural way that makes ethics more relevant, not only in the lab, but also on a personal level, so collectively and individually. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. And Kelly, do you want to say anything about how people should
Of course, yeah. Panelists, feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question. I just ask that you raise your hand first. Attendees, if you'd like to write any of your questions in the Q&A, we'll kind of take those in order. And if you have more to say, just let me know and we will unmute you.
Thank you. So I have a question actually, and this one is for the Neuroethical Ethos group. And I was very intrigued that this was something that emerged out of just your experience. So could you talk about that a little bit more? Like, how did you guys come together as a group and just go, you know, we really need to look at this?
Sure, that's a really good question. So both Juhi and I did part of our training at the University of Washington, which at the time, so I was a graduate student and Juhi was doing a postbac. We both happened to end up in Pittsburgh years later. but at the time, they still do have a National Science Foundation funded, it's called ERC, Engineering Research Center. And so one of the big thrusts of that group was a neuroethics arm, essentially. And so they, and Sarah Goring is the primary person there. They've really developed a core competency in neuroethics and kind of trying to provide trainees at the center with neuroethics training. And so that's the background that I was coming out of, and then now joining as a postdoc, our current group. One of the researchers from University of Washington reached out to see if they could do a couple like research seminars with us to get to evaluate our views on some of these issues. And so they came out and we had a really big discussion group with I think about 40 people. And after that, there was a lot of indication from trainees that they wanted more of this. And what came out is that they actually all hated the ethics class that they had to take. Most of them are in the bioengineering department. And I mean, Judy probably speak more of this because she's taken that class. I have not. But everyone was like, we want more of these conversations, but we kind of stay away from them because it's terrible. And it's like a 6 to 9 p.m. class. We hate it. Like, we just don't want to engage with it. And I'd seen that sort of my experience with ethics training. And so we decided that it might be a good time to try to create something based on the University of Washington model and try to just have more casual discussions as if we were at a cafe or something at a conference and we could just, you know, talk casually about it. And that's become more formalized over the course of the last couple of years.
Yeah, I would just add to that also that I think there's been a really strong interest, you know, expressed by members of the lab, and there had been even kind of prior to this initial session that we did with the group from the University of Washington. So, you know, this gets at kind of what we talked about in the presentation about leaning into the conversations that people are having and the kinds of things that people are already interested in talking about. You know, these discussions were sort of happening informally, and we wanted to really formalize them and make them a more integral part of the lab and the research that we do.
Yeah, I think all these projects have a very interesting creation story, right? How did these things emerge? And so, you know, I appreciated Karina talking about her personal story and how she came to do this work. I think these stories are very important, and they put a human face on the ethics. And so one of my questions too is, I think all of these projects indicate exploring different ways to do ethics education, coming up with alternatives, right? So I know that that's where our NSF study started, and they all have a cultural component. So I'm an anthropologist and a design anthropologist, and so the cultural aspects are very interesting to me. And it sounds like they are to you as well, to the panelists for this group. And maybe that's specifically to Karina.
Yes, so one of the things that I think we can also move towards is to purposefully design these types of activities, these types of learning activities, so that they're not haphazard, right? Like something that happens as an accident. And so challenging folks to think that way, right, I think is important, because then on the product is a learner that now has connected to what they knew prior to being exposed to this content, right? And perhaps they might have different beliefs after that, because now they've been part of a social environment that has valued their perspective, and so they were more open to listen to other perspectives. So I do find that it's critical to create these spaces in the academic setting to engage more students.
Yeah.
It looks like Emmanuel has a question or has a hand raised. I don't know if he wants to jump in.
Great, thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much. I actually have a question for the Neuroethos group. And so I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on something, because you mentioned a specific topic that was part of your discussions, which is inclusion, and that's the main also topic of this conference. But I was wondering if you have other ethical issues, more maybe kind of, let's say, related to the actual, let's say, practice of neuroscience that you have discussed and that you have deal with in your group, in your project. Thank you.
Yeah, so we started with a broad-ranging list of topics, right? So we're ranging from topics that are kind of on the research ethics level, so things like consent, things like the rights of participants, and that kind of area, all the way out to questions of free will and how that intersects with neuroscience and neural engineering, questions about development of neurotechnologies and the ethical implications of that, and even this sort of diversity, equity, inclusion set of topics. We're kind of focused in on areas of relevance with our research, right? So it was accessibility from the standpoint of disability and brain-computer interface use, or trust in medical research and medical researchers, and a lot of our work is very on the sort of clinical side. So all of the topics that we've come up with kind of touch on a broad range of levels of ethical questions related to neuroscience and neural engineering.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and it looks like Daniel Schiff, thank you, Eric. You mentioned in the chat, there was a question from Daniel Schiff a little earlier that he asked, I do not believe believe was addressed. Question, do you have a sense of why particular disciplines or labs proposed different priorities or approaches? And I'm not sure if this is directed to our panel, Elizabeth?
Daniel, feel free to mute yourself too.
I
want to
think
clarify.
it's related to our panel. I mean, the composition of the graduate student groups was different, isn't it? There were in one department, there were a lot of international students. In one department, we had a very vocal female student talking about the issues that female students ran into. On the other hand, the situation of the departments played a role. The atmosphere in the departments played a role, what the students had experienced. So also the approach they took was very different. One department, they did something like the 10 commandments, you shall not do this and you shall do that, and others had a more flexible way. So it really depended on what they had experienced. Maybe others from our group want to join in. Maybe Eric, you have a...
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I mean, I don't know that we felt that there was huge discipline differences as much as it was departmental culture differences and leadership, right? As Elizabeth pointed out, sometimes, if a certain student was leading, we tended to cover topics that certainly were more personal to them. And what we thought a lot about with the UTSA program that I think Francisca and Laura did a good job of is making sure we tried to get as broad kind of feedback, as Francisca said, about the diversity aspect. Is it wasn't strictly, sometimes we were worried that it was so much influenced by the one leader. So we covered certain topics in depth, but maybe there were things that were important to other students that we were missing, that I think we evolved over time in terms of making sure we had the process in place that would help to make sure the more topics were addressed, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Let's see, I think we have a few more minutes. Kelly, do you have anything you want to bring up at this point before we break? Whoops.
I'm muted, of course. No, I don't think so. I was just curious, Dina, did you see any diversity in the ethics issues that came up in the IREDS program? I know you had certain topics you covered specifically in that curriculum. Did you see it blossom into other kind of topics among the students?
It didn't, not in the research, because it was a randomized controlled trial. The intervention was pretty carefully scripted. Oh, sorry, let me turn my video on. And so the topics actually, the conversation actually followed what we were sort of asking about, and also what we were demonstrating on the OSF at the same time. I think in some of the IREDS approaches that we've done after the research, it hasn't, except that it will often, and these are related, I think, but it will often veer into questions about how best to teach these things. So not just the content of, but how do you best learn about this? And so some of the students would talk about having had a fairly good experience in the lab that they came from to the lab that they were in when we were having the discussion. And so that was one of the interesting conversations that came up. And I think that there are ethical dimensions to how we teach these things as well. And so that is along the lines, I think, of what you're asking for.
Yeah, thank you. That definitely reflects what we've seen as well in our interviews and some of what we've been doing.
Yeah.
Any?
It looks
Yeah,
like Brooke has his hand raised.
Oh, Brooke.
Yeah.
Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, what I was at, I mean, what a wonderful, rich set of experiences you all are bringing to this. It's wonderful to listen and think about what, in our context, what other things could be done and all. What the thing that I was wondering is if several of the groups could comment on the ones that encourage student involvement, could give us a sense of how the students, what kind of resources did they have if they were talking about these problems to actually decide, if they had differences of opinion or, different judgments being made, how were they deciding what was the right thing to do or not? I mean, was there a sense that they had a confidence in their own ability to talk about what's right and wrong in this context of scientific research and what goes on in my lab? I mean, whether it's about the topics of the day and in terms of, who should be trashed if the pedestrian walks in front of the self-driven car. I mean, do you want to kill me or do you want to kill the pedestrian? And, I just wondered what kinds of ideas, what kinds of resources did they have to say, well, I think it's right because of this or that. I mean, if any of you have experiences with that, that you could share. That.
I mean, from our side, I think that's actually a really important question, because often we'll see in some of our sort of breakout sessions that we do with these questions that we'll have a particular student or trainee who is more versed in this area just sort of dominate the conversation. Or we'll have some of the PIs who kind of join the conversation somewhat dominated. As we have continued doing this, and we really try to focus on the idea of dialogue and trying to have a diverse set of questions, we also have somewhat actively tried to arrange groups so that sometimes those dominant people are all in the same group together, giving more space to other students, especially some of the younger trainees who come in, right? They weren't exposed to any of this type of conversation or these type of topics beforehand. And so it's taken them a little while to really feel like they are more empowered to be able to ask questions. And leaving the sort of scope of our discussions a little bit open has allowed them, I think, to ask like, well, I didn't realize this, but how does this affect this one thing that we've been doing? And then the entire conversation will shift to that one topic that person's come up, and then we kind of come back to the general questions as well. I think sort of that, again, engineering the discourse a little bit has enabled those balances to be more apparent, I think, for us.
I think in our project, it was like that students and faculty recurred to existing handbooks, student handbook, faculty handbook, policies, guidelines. And in our case, it was perhaps that the graduate students, they had similar interests, and the clash was more between graduate students on the one hand and faculty on the other hand. This was the clash we ran into.
Francisca might beat me up for this, but I'm going to call her out because I know you mentioned in your discussion, because part of your leadership was navigating some difference of opinions among students or how to present that. So certainly Elizabeth is 100% correct. One of the big challenges is bringing this to faculty and having the conversation. But I think there was some internal challenges, right, Francisca, maybe?
Yeah, so I mean, so I just as an example, so in terms of like undergrad involvement and undergrad, management, I said, I think that was a big topic, I guess, in our group that I'll say was a big kind of like a clash, because some people thought was like, well, I don't want any grads whatsoever. And then some grad students, right? And then some others like, I want like 10 because I want them all to do all these different parts. But I guess the way that us as a student kind of handled it, I guess, is we as students had different opinions. And of course, faculty is going to have their opinion about not just that topic, but all these other topics. So one thing that we all emphasize strongly because of that is that if you're transparent or upfront about what your opinion is to you as a faculty member and you as a student, it helps avoid those clashes down the line. Because I think like for those, like for example, for that specific example, I'll say, I personally don't know if there's a right or wrong for that. I mean, I think each individual is going to want to manage their students or want to manage their lab in each and like their own respective way. But as long as you're upfront and forward and transparent about what you specifically want to do, and so then down the line, you're not surprised being like, "What, you want me to do this?" I think it was the main thing that we as students wanted to emphasize with our specific guidelines for our specific when we wrote them and had these discussions.
Yeah, I want to add also that I think part of what we've been trying to direct people towards or get people to really internalize is this idea that there isn't necessarily always a right answer, and frequently there isn't a right answer to a lot of these questions, right? And being comfortable with sitting with those questions and being able to converse with them in this communal space while acknowledging that it isn't as cut and dry as like a training module might have you believe. It becomes really important because that also gives people the space to realize that we can still come to an agreement about what we value as a lab and what we want to work towards, without necessarily having to put things in the good and bad columns.
Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, so it looks like we are out of time. A lot more discussion could be had here. Thank you all to our panel. Excellent work. I would love to be able to carry on this discussion with all of you. We are going to take a short 15-minute break here, and then we will come back for our second session this morning. Eric Bray will chair that session, and it will be starting at 1:45 Central Time, 2:45 Eastern, and we'll see you soon.